Welcome back to another episode of the Reading Room Ruffians, your favorite library podcast. Today we have a special guest, Merrilee Matheny, author of Swift Justice, the story of John F. Morgan and the last public hanging in West Virginia. We are so glad to have you here with us, Merrilee. If you'd like to take a moment to just talk a little bit about yourself, where we can find information about you, if you have social media or a website, anything like that.
Okay, thank you for having me. My name, as you introduced me, is Merrilee Fisher Matheny, and I'm related to the Fishers in Jackson County and a great many other people, and grew up just over the border in Putnam County,
Oh, wow.
and which is how I got interested in all of this in the beginning. And I've lived in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Texas, and I'm currently in Pennsylvania. As for social media, I steer clear, and I have reasons for that.
That's fair.
But I happily give out my email address to people who want to correspond with me. And I do maintain a presence on Facebook so that people can message me if they want to reach out to me. I just simply don't. I'm not on Facebook,
Yeah.
so to speak. But I've spent my years as a social worker in private practice as a psychotherapist.
Oh, wow.
And the last several years before retirement overseas, working for a government defense contract on military bases, counseling military members and their families.
Ooh.
So that's kind of who I am. I've been enjoying retirement and lots of travel for the last few years. And I'm getting ready to head back down to West Virginia to visit folks.
Yay.
Cool.
She'll be here on the 11th and the 21st, right? 21st?
21st is
Yeah.
what you told me.
Yeah.
For your genealogy day, yes.
Oh, wow. Yeah. That's
Yeah.
exciting.
Of June?
Yes.
Oh, beans. The episode won't be out before then.
It should be.
That's 2 weeks. Also, we cannot hear you, Mother. Just FYI.
I do not have a
She's gonna have to
microphone. We're
sit
having to
next to
share.
her. You're going to have to scoot closer to Suzie like you
lean
love her.
in, lean in.
You might want to tell
Pretend,
them.
Real up close.
pretend like you like each other.
Exactly. I know we can probably get it out that Friday beforehand. That's doable.
Okay.
Okay. So let's get started with some of these questions. What got you into writing this book? Like, what inspired you to write this book?
Well, that began when I was a teenager, living out on Route 34, what we now know of as McLean Pike. And I read an article from the New York Sun, a very famous article called The Shutting Out, SHETT, Shutting Out of John Morgan.
Mm-hmm.
In its time, it was one of the most famous color articles ever written. And in fact, it was news itself because of how good it was. It's certainly politically incorrect nowadays, but it is greatly entertaining. Color pieces were written to entertain the public, not necessarily to give them factual news, although that was part of it too, but basically for entertainment. And at that time, West Virginia was very entertaining. It was seen as a strange land with peculiar people, and people wanted to hear more about this place where you would want information, but you wouldn't necessarily want to go there because it was seen as murderland.
Yeah.
It was literally called murderland and was considered rather dangerous and barbaric.
Pretty
And
much like
the guy-
now.
No, yeah, not much has changed.
and very little. But the guy who wrote the article is anonymous. He is unnamed. And he pulled out every trope that we think of now as hillbilly stereotype, but hillbilly hadn't come into our lexicon until about 1904. So before then, it was mountaineers. The mountaineers were all called surly mountaineers. And the idea of the Hatfields and McCoys type feuds and gun running and whiskey moonshining and shootouts and this sort of thing all garnered national attention. So I would encourage everybody, all you have to do is look up the last public hanging in West Virginia, and you'll find parts of that New York Sun article. And if you're not familiar with the Sun, you may be familiar with a very famous article that came out in the Sun just a couple of weeks before John Morgan's hanging. And that was, yes, Virginia, there is a Santa Claus. And everybody is familiar with that. And again, that's a newspaper gathering and garnering. It's making its own news.
That's really cool.
Was the Sun a Pulitzer or a Hearst paper, or do we know?
Yes, we do. And you asked me too quickly. It's one or the other. And right off the bat, I can't remember, but there was a great deal of rivalry between the major papers. 1897, the year of the murders, was also known as the year of journalism. It was the year when things began to change, and newspapers weren't just reporting the news, they began to make the news. They began to get involved in investigations. They just sometimes went off the rails a little bit, but they would offer rewards. They would go way out of their way to get all this information. And John Morgan's, that whole drama in Jackson County pulled in the national press. And even those who didn't, and certainly from the neighboring states, but you had places as far away as California and Washington State and some Midwestern states still picking up the news and printing it in their own papers and following what was happening.
Wow.
That's amazing.
It is, yeah.
Do we want to say who John Morgan was and what he did?
Yeah. I figure we can probably talk a little bit about that. So listeners who haven't heard this story yet or gotten to this book yet know what they're getting into before they really get into it.
It's a really good book, and thank you for autographing mine for me, Merrilee, years ago.
You were very welcome.
Yeah, we had a good time at the premiere of the movie, too.
Yeah.
So
I was going to say, would you like to talk about it, or would you like me to read the back of your book?
You can do that if you want. That sort
can.
of says things pretty well.
All right. So this says, "This is a dead man's tale. In the fall of 1897, John Morgan picked up a hatchet and murdered 3 members of a prominent family in Jackson County, West Virginia, and did his best to murder a 4th, who fortunately survived to bear witness. Within 3 days, Morgan was captured, indicted, tried, and sentenced to hang, despite his attorney's efforts to mount an insanity defense. He then escaped from the Ripley jail, leading law enforcement officers on a merry chase while the community lived in terror. Ultimately, he met the hangman in a spectacle that shocked the nation. No one ever discovered what drove this likable young farmhand to commit murder, yet more than a century later, tantalizing clues remain."
It's an absolutely fascinating story.
It is.
it's really great. It gives you a lot of insight into what rural life in West Virginia and pretty much everywhere in sort of the Midwest, and we forget how crowded the rural area was, but it's still awful isolated. And there
Yeah.
was it was, pretty weird. But everybody knew about it.
Everybody knew about it. It was interesting when I was researching. I was up at the archives, West Virginia Archives in Charleston. And one of the researchers there told me, she said, if you ever want to know what your ancestors were getting up to, read the papers. And that was such a fascinating thing to find out just how much was in the papers. And I think One of the most interesting things for me, and the thing that I kept falling over as I did my research, and was so exciting. I can remember that I was always constantly calling somebody up to say, guess what I found? You remember the old game, the Kevin Bacon's 6 Degrees of Separation?
Yeah.
How everything led back to Kevin Bacon. Well, what I was finding was that there would be all these fascinating entries in the newspapers and these articles, and I would think, oh, that's about the governor, or that's about this person, or that's about that person. Everything led back to John Morgan. And so that's why when you're looking at the book, there's all this drama that's going on with all these other people, but it involves John Morgan. And what he did impacted them, and what they did impacted his fate as well. I guess a good example of that was the petition that his lawyer made to try to get his execution commuted to life imprisonment because of mental incapacity. And Atkinson, who was usually pretty good about pardons and commutations and was quite bold about stepping up and doing those kinds of things, just really balked and stepped back. There were a lot of reasons for that. But one of them was the fact that he had just married a 2 times widow, a young socialite. This was her 3rd marriage. And she was on trial for forging her millionaire husband's will.
Ooh.
And
I love that for her.
And her, she probably did not, but since everything went to her rather than the children,
Yeah.
they were put out. And so they went after her. And the thing was that it went across the nation, and they did this whole survey by governors. Oh, if the governor's wife is convicted of a felony, would he pardon her so she wouldn't go to prison? This was terribly embarrassing. But what was even worse, as they were deciding what was going to become of her, was the fact that her judge was the judge who had sentenced John Morgan. So Atkinson is in no position to cross Judge Reese Blizzard in these circumstances. In any other situation, if that hadn't been the case, there's a chance that he could have ended up in one of the asylums or in Moundsville. But
wow.
Oh, Moundsville.
Well, I think it's
we visited there once.
Beg your pardon. I think it's interesting. Once I've been to programs and meetings where people from Jackson County remember their relatives talking about this, grandparents and all the way back, and actually have connections with it, close connections. And this has gone down through families, not just in the newspaper and all. There's a lot of information out there. Some of it's a little contradictory. But in Jackson County, there's less than 6 degrees of separation between John. My family, my mother's family, was from the Sandyville area, which is not even close to where this happened. And I thought, well, I don't have any connection there. And then I looked at the list of the grand jurors, and it was a great-grandfather on it from John Floyd. I thought, whoa, small county.
it is. And all that drama impacted absolutely everyone. My great-great-grandmother was at the hanging, as was several other ancestors. Jim Fisher was who was also one of my ancestors, was the next door neighbor to John and Rebecca Morgan, and was the half brother to Chloe Post, and one of the murder victims. And of course, and Chloe's mother lived with him. So everybody knew everybody knew everybody's business. And I think that was the thing that was so shocking. Everybody knew John Morgan, and he wouldn't have done something like this. If Alice had not lived to tell the tale, chances are Morgan wouldn't have been accused.
I can see that.
Because it wouldn't have occurred to people.
But they would associate it with a tramp or something like that? Some stranger going through?
Yeah, stranger.
People always want to say it's someone passing through. It
Mhm.
couldn't have been
Yeah.
our neighbor, friends, or relatives.
Do you think that all the press and all the publicity contributed to the speed at which this all happened? Like the conviction and stuff like that, and the whole drama part of it?
I think that why everything moved so quickly. He committed the murders on day one. He was caught on day one. On day two, he was indicted. On day three, he was tried and found guilty. On day four, he was sentenced. And 30 days later, he was summarily executed. But what was happening when John Morgan was brought into town, there was a huge mob there to lynch him. And Judge Lynch stepped forward to do crowd control, and he basically promised them if they let justice run its course, that it would be swift and sure, and that if we, excuse me, that was my stuff falling down. If it was indeed, if he was indeed guilty, there wouldn't be any shenanigans, illegal shenanigans like they were used to seeing, where trials would drag out and people would get off. That he would make sure that justice was served, and served very quickly. But the mob made it very clear to everybody. In fact, there were articles in the paper with headlines that says "Lynch mob bulldozes jury." There was a lot of that stuff going on, and they were saying, either you deem him guilty and he gets his life taken, or we do it ourselves. So I think that's why things move so quickly.
Well, he nearly didn't get executed, though, did he? I mean, he came pretty close to escaping, well, the news, because he managed to escape the jail.
He did, and that
made it more exciting.
It was very exciting, and it was quite the desperado romance at the time. John Morgan was seeing himself like Billy the Kid and Jesse James, and I'm this famous West Virginia desperado, and I got to show up looking good. But he put all his efforts into that one big escape plan, and then he didn't know what to do once he was out in the big wide world. What he did was went straight to Rebecca and his son, and he didn't want to leave them. And he said later that if he had to live away from his family, he wouldn't have wanted to live. And they had trouble getting him, his family had trouble getting him to head out. He was very anxious to just hang out with them. Literally. And he was known to be quite the woodsman. Everyone was saying he won't be found. Oh, we won't get him again. He'll head for the mountains just like his father did before him when he murdered someone. But John blew it. For one thing, he was wearing the new suit that O.J. Morrison gave him in response to his interview. He had told him that if you do this, I'll give you $25 and I'll give you a new suit and new shoes. And the shoes didn't fit. And his feet were swollen and blistered, and he was very unhappy, and he was cold and he's wet, and he got lost in the woods and went around and around and around in circles instead of getting miles and miles ahead. He should have been the law thought he was 10, 12 hours ahead of them. He was just minutes. He could look behind and see them coming. He just
Wow.
couldn't organize. He was totally disorganized and everything was unraveling.
Tisk, tisk.
Yeah, they say if he had made it to the Ohio River and got on a boat, he'd have been in New Orleans, or anywhere. But he didn't do that. He wanted to be home.
Well, he went to his sisters after he went to his wife's, his father-in-law's. Then he went to his sister and brother-in-law's, and then he went on. So
how silly.
I mean, the whole thing is so tragic, too.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just like odd and tragic.
Yeah.
All the way around.
Yeah. The rumors about his relationship with Chloe, but she took him in and cared for him. And he sort of grew up with the boy that he killed and Alice. And these were his family, and he slaughtered them, basically.
Basically, yeah.
With an axe.
Mm.
Yeah. So, and it was really, it has really rung through Jackson County history. Everybody, has known about this when they're kids. And I used to judge social studies fair, and if there was not one last public hanging exhibit, it was a poor social studies fair. The kids were fascinated because it was real, it was true, and was related to relatives too, which is.
And it's a mystery.
And it's a mystery.
It's a mystery because we also don't know if he committed those murders by himself, who else was involved. And, it's an interesting thing. People do these tell-all things where they come out and they accuse this person of that person of having committed a crime. And I wasn't about to go down that rabbit hole. But what I did do was really discuss in detail what was known at the time and what was being discussed at the time. And John Morgan's confessions that involved Ben Anderson and Alice Post were all detailed in the newspapers. People were talking about these things. And they pursued Ben Anderson and brought him in, and there was supposed to be a trial. And it was all very interesting because everything was being brought out into the open, and all of a sudden, everything was stuffed back into a box. And people stopped looking, and everything ground to a halt. And that was the end of that.
And that's what I like about the book. It tells you what they thought at the time, what they knew at the time, what they didn't know at the time, and the speculations. But it's not like you've, put words in people's mouths or made up scenes. It's just really a well done historical account of this murder, and I really like it.
I think my favorite part was the quotes. It's like, this is what happened. This is what they said.
Yeah.
But it also, the quotes leave you guessing too. It's like you would like to ask a few other questions or something, looking back on it maybe, to maybe get more detail. I don't know, but I was impressed.
I think the most frustrating thing talking about the quotes was that O.J. Morrison only included bits and pieces of the court transcripts. And the court transcripts, the originals no longer exist. What's funny is in the courthouse files, we have John Morgan's basic court papers. We have the orders that the judge wrote, his sentencing, that sort of thing, those legal documents. We don't have the transcripts, but also tucked in with those legal documents is a folded up copy of the New York Sun's article, The Shutting Out of John Morgan.
Wow.
Well, can you talk a little bit about the the day of the hanging, because that's what made this really notorious, why the son was there and every place else. I think it just, and I think it, I didn't know about the governor's wife, but I knew that the governor, that the local people were very concerned about a pardon because of what was going on during the day of the hanging.
There were thousands of people in town. And even though Ripley was a temperance town, it didn't mean people weren't drunk. And there were mobs. There were people just having a good old time. People brought their children and their families. The word out was that this might be the last public hanging in West Virginia. And hanging back then was a big form of public entertainment. And people came from all over. They came from all the neighboring states to see what might be the last public hanging. And Sheriff Shin knew that if there was any possibility that the governor might hold the sentence, just to delay it till they could see what to do about Ben Anderson, or if there was any commutation so that he was sent to a mental institution, he wouldn't be able to control the crowds, and that Morgan would have hanged one way or the other. So he was going to kind of steal the march before the last train came in case there was someone on that train to stop things and get everybody out to the gallows and get this thing over with as soon as possible. The reporters, in terms of numbers, that were out on that hillside, anywhere from 2,000 to 5,000. But it was a huge number of people. People came in their wagons, they brought their kids, they brought picnics. They came and spent 2 or 3 days, they camped out. This was in November, of course. This was November the 16th. It was a Thursday. It was, yeah. It's the lead up to December 16th. It's a lead up to Christmas. So you have all these ads in the paper for come get your Christmas stuff. There's going to be a huge crowd in town. We won't put the breakables out, but we'll put those out the day after the hanging. Come get your presents. And it was a fascinating time. There were minstrel shows. There was Punch and Judy shows. There were all kinds of vendors selling everything from hot roasted peanuts to John Morgan's confessions. He made several confessions, and the shortest ones went for a dime, and the more expensive ones went for 25 cents. O.J. Morrison's murder pamphlet, the murders of the Post-Green family, he got enough on the proceeds from selling that little book about, and most of you have probably seen that. I know you have copies there in the library. He got enough money from those proceeds to start a new store in Clarksburg, and from there, the new store in Charleston.
Wow.
So he was quite the entrepreneur, and he knew a good business opportunity when he saw it. And if it weren't for him, we would have very little information about this whole affair, but he very carefully wrote everything down as it was happening. But it was such an outlandish spectacle, and it got printed up in the northern papers. And basically what was said was that West Virginia was barbaric and that Governor Atkinson was a leader of barbarians. That in West Virginia, a man's punishment was a gladiator sport. It was a huge embarrassment. And it gave West Virginia a black eye, but certainly what was happening in Jackson County was devastating, because it was very personal to them. They had seen themselves as becoming progressive, and they had entered the industrial age, and they were becoming a wealthier society there, and really looked upon themselves as getting somewhere. And to be seen in this kind of way was really very difficult. And this was the final straw, and it was what moved West Virginia toward getting rid of public executions and finally getting rid of the death penalty.
Wow.
That is, what can you say? I mean, it was pretty. I can't believe people would go to watch that.
Honestly,
that's
I've
the thing
always
that's
felt
like-
that way.
yeah.
About executions and like hangings and stuff is like
You wouldn't
it's
go
like
there?
a huge sport.
No, I would not.
It's like I just don't think
I
I.
think
was
I'd
on
go.
here.
But it's real funny because when you read Dickens and all of those plays,
Yeah.
where that was a big deal. They would rent out
Yeah.
windows before the gallows at Tyburn or whatever, not quite into the late 19th century, but it wasn't just West Virginia. It was all over the world, all over the country.
Mhm.
But we had that reputation. The
Yeah.
Hatfields and McCoys did not help,
Yeah.
and then
Yeah.
the coal mine wars later on just sort of cinched it. But yeah, it was. It wasn't that unusual, but it was, I think, almost a perfect storm of circumstances and the press getting a hold of it and the politics. And all of a sudden, whoo, we got this really good story that's been handed down through our county for over 100 years now.
Mm-hmm.
I'm looking at pictures over here of the hanging. There's like a couple apparently. I think these are like legit. There's a ton of people here. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, there's a lot.
Looks like a concert or something. It's wild.
That's kind of what you can almost compare it
Yeah.
It's
to.
like the vibe.
Yeah.
Sort of like that.
I just really, I don't know.
It's Coachella.
I've never understood the draw for that. Like, I don't know.
I mean, different times.
Yeah.
Maybe you.
But
how
honestly,
bored
if you,
were you back then?
Well, there was
Also-
no YouTube,
Legitimately.
right?
but you also
It's
think
like
about.
there's
it
no
still is a draw for
brain
people
rot,
even now.
you know?
I mean,
Well, there have been discussions with some places about televising
yeah,
executions.
Mhm.
Thank goodness we've not done that.
yeah,
But
yeah, for real.
with some people, have been actually serious about it.
yeah.
I
Yeah.
can't
And I
imagine.
think one of the things I'd like to point out is those pictures that you're looking at were mostly taken by a female photographer,
Mm-hmm.
which was highly unusual at the time. And her name was Susan King. She was a beautiful young woman. She was the only photographer in Ripley at the time. Her father had not wanted her to go to the execution, and she was determined to go. And he said he would help her. That photography equipment was extremely heavy and unwieldy. And he said he would help her only on two conditions. One was that she would stay to the fringes of the crowd and not get in the press of the crowd. He was worried about her getting hurt or trampled.
Yeah.
And secondly, that she would not actually take a photo once the trap was sprung.
Mm.
And she did not. So I was interested in the fact that there were some women who played key roles. Susan King was one of them.
Yeah.
Annie McVeigh was another one. She was one of the very few female court stenographers. And Judge Reese Blizzard was so progressive that he brought her in. And she's the one who did the transcripts. Not only that, but she was asked to mount the gallows with the officials and be there because John had asked for 10 minutes to give a speech. He decided not to because he thought he would be too emotional and might break down. He did talk a little bit, but she was there for that reason only. And people really commented on that. This pretty young widow climbed the gallows and stood up there as a man was being hanged. That was unheard of.
I just think
Wild.
the whole thing with the fact that most of the people knew him
Mhm.
and they were surprised that he did that. and all the the lynch mob and all the publicity.
Yeah.
I can't imagine how you would have felt during that time, especially when you saw all those strangers come into your town. It was just horrible.
Yeah.
Unless you were having a store or a restaurant, and then you're going, ooh.
Well,
Yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
I guess that's okay.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting when the theories that why he did it and his condition, what happened to his son later on, his dad, and about the murder his father committed, and the fact that he was shot by a posse is very interesting. Where it goes along with his whole family. Why that was why he was taken in by the Greens, the post Greens, and what could have triggered it. It's just because speculation's always been
And we'll never know.
do you have a personal favorite theory?
I could mount an argument for about 3 different theories and get you to believe every one of them. But I think some of it coming from my background as a psychotherapist, and really being aware of what happens with human behavior, I tend to believe that one of his parents, both parents died very young, and so we can't know who, but I believe that one of his parents had Huntington's or was a carrier of Huntington's. And his son, Albert, was definitively diagnosed and ended up in Spencer in the asylum because of Huntington's. And John's brother also died out in Washington in an asylum. And John's symptoms, and those are the clues that I talk about on the back of the book. This cognitive decline, the disorganization, the delusional qualities of his thought processes, his inability to understand what was happening to him, all lead me to believe that he was in the early stages of Huntington's. Now, it is fairly rare for Huntington's to lead to really violent, aggressive behavior, but it can. And so there may have been other things at work. Was he a sociopath? I don't think he was a sociopath. Certainly sociopathology is in his family. I haven't mentioned that business that, Andy Raines, his father, even though John was called Morgan, he was not a Morgan, he was a Raines. We have that parent, and then we have his great-great-grandfather, Jesse Hughes.
Oh, he was Jesse Hughes. Oh, wow.
Yeah, so, and Jesse Hughes was a notorious Indian scout who, depending on which way you looked at him, was either a serial killer or the savior of the settlements. And in that day and age, probably both. So we don't know. We don't know everything that went into it, but I think there were probably many factors.
Mm-hmm.
I don't believe it was a robbery. There were a great many things to point to robbery, but there was never any money found.
Yeah.
Well, it's a fascinating story, and I think you've done a phenomenal job with the book.
It's really a well-done book. It's well written. It's well designed. It's a really good book. Well illustrated.
Yes. You'll have everyone will have to come out on the 21st of the Genealogy Day here at the Jackson County Library in Ripley and meet Merrilee. She'll be here that day signing books.
Yeah.
But before we finish up, because I know we're getting close to the end.
Yeah.
Am I the only person who had no idea that this was a thing until this book?
I didn't know. I had no idea.
Okay, cool.
It's
not just me.
West Virginia history.
I did not know about it until I worked here. But I knew about it before the book came out, but I didn't learn about it until I worked here.
Yeah.
I had no idea until I heard that we were doing this book, and I
Like,
looked it
I
up.
knew
I'm
that
like,
our last-
excuse me? This is a thing?
Public hanging was in Ripley, but that's as far as I knew.
I didn't even know that.
I knew that. That's the only part I knew.
I am a bad parent.
Ain't nobody told me nothing.
We didn't know nothing.
Yeah.
No, seriously, it's not something that, at least when I was in school, that we went over.
Yeah, well, I
It might
I
have
don't
been in
think
the
we
book,
ever
but
went over it. In
I don't think
This
it
is
was.
not
I don't
something
really
we learned in
remember.
West Virginia history.
Yeah,
I was
no.
kidding. We were more into
We had to memorize the counties.
uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
it wasn't
that was
on the
worth it.
golden horseshoe test.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, still, this feels like a fairly significant thing that they probably
Yeah, it
should have
really
told
does.
us.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, but we didn't learn about the mine wars either in West Virginia history. when I
No.
was
Oh, no,
there.
that's definitely not a thing.
Or
Because
the,
that's
Hawks Nest Tunnel or any of that stuff.
Nope.
But we had the
Maybe it's 'cause
largest
that stuff
axe
seems like not
factory
great.
in the world.
The largest
That's
axe
cool.
factory.
That's what I learned in the 7th grade.
That's cool.
wow. That's something to be proud of. Lars.
Well, I don't know. This guy, murdered people with that.
There you go. Well, if they would have continued that story,
Foreshadowing.
Yeah.
they could have.
Even the
Would've
Washington
known.
State, because that's where you're
Yeah,
at.
yeah.
My gosh.
That's pretty crazy.
Yeah, it is.
Wow.
It is.
I think we're at 42 and a half minutes
And
now.
we promised to keep it short.
So,
So
I don't know if you have any final thoughts or things that you would like to share with us, Merrilee, but you are more than welcome to. And then we're going to hop off of here.
I think I'm good. I just wanted to tell you I appreciated your having me and hope to meet
Absolutely.
you
yes,
a week from
Saturday.
Saturday, I guess.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah, absolutely. We are so grateful that you came on. Thank you so much for reaching out and coming on. This
Yeah.
has been a very cool and enlightening story, and more people should know about it, especially
Mhm.
local people. But I think it's a pretty cool slice of history. And yeah, you did very well with this.
I want to thank Maxine too, Maxine Landfrey, for turning me onto this and letting me know
Mhm.
what was going on, so we could
Yeah.
we could do this.
And that's one of those interesting connections I was talking about. Is I was doing research and working with Maxine,
Uh-huh.
and we learned we were Fisher cousins.
Mhm.
Oh wow,
Oh,
that's
wow.
cool.
Small
Well,
world.
all right. If we don't have anything else to say, I guess.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank
Bye.
you.
Yeah, thanks again.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye.
All right, before we go,
Oh, I turned mine off.
it's okay. Only the best libraries
Wow.
have librarians who don't shush you.
You just turn off our cameras too soon.